Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The Exile's Return. Episode 3. Chapter 15. AAE Law POV. Walking towards her office, she spotted Beta Jackson and Gamma Steven once again sitting outside of her office in the waiting room chairs, same as they had been yesterday. Didn't they have anything better to do? She glanced at Jordan. He still appeared nervous around them. He held out a stack of messages, then pointed to 3 other men sitting just down the hall on other chairs. Kellen turned to look at them. All 3 of them turned their eyes on her. All wolves, though not of her current pack. She could detect several different pack scents, but didn't know whose packs they belonged to. Not one of them spoke, they all just stared at her. Returning her attention to Jordan, she smiled. Do they have appointments? Yes, Kellen, right after Mr. Beta and Mr. Gamma. She nearly laughed out loud at his mentioning of their rank as their last name. They actually did have last names, but would have introduced themselves by rank, she guessed. Standard wolf and culture. Mr. Delta, from Eclipse, and CO at 1145, another Mr. Delta from Harvest Moon CO at 12, and John from Moonlight Entertainment at 12:15. Well, at least one of them had been smart enough to introduce themselves as a human. Thanks, Jordan. She nodded and stepped into her office and put her briefcase down. Glanced at the stack of messages in her hand, and most were from packs she could tell by the Human World company names. It seemed she was going to be in high demand and very busy trying to sort out the honest from the tactical to the enemy packs. Well, she had time on her side, seeing that everything was being tendered in the human way. Kellen started writing out the list of names of the packs contacting her. She would be able to call the ones she couldn't figure out who they were, and have them declare themselves. With this many messages to call and discuss a new alliance with, she was certain that they would all take her call. She'd likely only get to speak with the Deltas at first. Though any actual serious offers would come from the Beta or Alpha himself, most others could not be considered high on the offering pack's list of priorities, but she imagined a verbal offer was not only a prelude to a written formalized agreement, which would have to be handled by the Alpha himself. A formalized written offer was of more interest to her at this point. It was 11 a.m. and her appointment wasn't here yet, unlike Tony not to be punctual. Kellen stepped out of her office for the first time today, and looked down the hall. Jordan, Tony didn't call? He's not usually late. No, Jordan shook his head. She was about to get her new phone out and call him when her wolf hearing picked up the elevator ding. She glanced up and a bright smile lit her face. There he was, and sporting a huge bunch of flowers. She walked down the hall to greet him, aware Jackson and Steven were watching her. He embraced her and she hugged him back tightly. It had been a week since she had seen him and Lauren, but she had talked to the both of them every other day, and today he was here to talk business with her, which totally surprised her actually. He had family lawyers, what he would need her for was a mystery. He took stock of the men sitting around in the waiting area and a deep frown creased his brow. He locked eyes with Beta Jackson for a moment. Fear didn't seem to come from him, but as he walked into her office, he said, "Those 2 belong to the prick who kidnapped you, right?" jerking his thumb in their direction. Kellen nearly laughed out loud. He'd seen the press conference and had recognized them right away. She nodded as she heard a growl come from both Jackson and Steven at the offensive remark directed towards their longtime childhood friend and Alpha. Disrespect was not something they would not tolerate. If he'd been anything but human in the human world, Kellen could well imagine the fight that would have just broken out as her Alphas Beta and Gamma put him in his place. So a business call? Not the normal, you and Lauren seemed fine, she queried, though she doubted this was a divorce issue. Tony loved Lauren, practically worshipped the ground she walked on. She never saw a divorce in their future. He handed the flowers to her. From Lauren Arndt. Yes, we are both fine, he chucked. Kellen took the flowers. They were already in a pretty white and gold box, no need for a vase. Her favorite flowers, yellow tulips and white Gerber, is a special order, no doubt. Tell Lauren, thank you for the flowers, they are beautiful. She smiled at them as she placed them on her desk. So what can I do for you today, Tony? It's Ray Ray. Apparently she met a man and wants to get married. I want an ironclad prenup, as does Lauren of course, so who else would I go to for my baby girl? Kellen was more than shocked. Ray Ray is only 18, is she crazy? Didn't she just start university? Yes, and apparently met him there. I'm not happy about it and neither is Lauren, but Ray Ray is convinced he is her soul mate. He stated, sounding quite frustrated and annoyed. How long has she known this man, and what is his name? Only a week or so, Kellen. Kellen stared at him incredulously as he ran his hand through his hair, showing his frustration. Apparently he is from some well-to-do family out east and his parents are now here and want to meet and discuss the marriage. What? Kellen frowned. After just a week. Yes, he nodded. She's been begging and pleading for 2 days now for us to meet his family. Lauren has finally given in and agreed to it, this Friday night. Kellen's frown deepened as she sat down on the couch in her office to think about it. Tony sat with her, shaking his head in just as much disbelief as she apparently. Humans, especially very wealthy ones, never rush to marriage. There were months of vetting each other's families out, then many months trying to sort out an agreeable prenup, investigations to make sure neither one of the marrying parties were trying to scam the other or that it wasn't a con job. And then there was at least a year spent on wedding planning. It didn't seem right to her. In her world, a week was nothing. Heck, wolves often marked and mated the day they met. It was a natural thing, but here in the human world a week was way too fast. Are you sure she's only known him a week? Is she pregnant? Kellen asked outright. That was usually the only thing that would force a quick marriage between two wealthy families, neither wanting the embarrassment of a baby born out of wedlock, or a horrendous custody battle that would likely end up public and tarnish their family names. Tony sighed. I asked that very question myself. Got a very angry Ray Ray in my face, screaming at me that she was still a virgin and that she wants to wait until she gets married. So does he. So are we getting married so they can have S**X? She mused. I don't buy it. Tony stood and paced around her office. Neither dole Kellen. She is completely smitten and love-struck. Christ is obsessed with him. Michael this and Michael that. Michael is so handsome, he's so dreamy, yada yada yada. Kellen sighed. Okay, I can do the prenup but it will take time, I will need all the details. The family he comes from, you know the drill. I'll have to vet them. It's not a quick thing and you'll have to get this Michael and his family to make an appointment. They might want to bring their own lawyers too, if they really do want a quick marriage. I can't believe they do. I thought we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Go for to dinner on Friday and meet them with us. Aonei was almost begging, it seemed. She smiled up at him. Of course, Tony. You only had to ask me, after everything you and Lauren have done for me. Of course yes. I'll have my nanny watch the kids. She likes overtime pay. Thank you, Kellen. This is truly a weight off my shoulders. He smiled and sat back down. Out of curiosity, why me and not your own lawyers? She knew his family had a whole team of lawyers as he'd married into a very wealthy and to-do family. Lauren was worth nearly 50 million, not that Tony had ever cared about her money, but Ray Ray was an heiress and things needed to be in order before any marriage could be arranged. You're a household name at the moment and Ray Ray has requested you do it. Something about hating Grandpa's stuffy old lawyers. You're more her style and closer to her age, will understand better, or so she thinks. More suited to her needs. And when she mentioned your name to Michael, apparently he laughed and said he saw you on TV and thought you were a great idea. His parents love strategic and professional people, they have been following your case. Happy for you to handle the prenup. Ark, she sighed and shook her head. Better not be groupies, she muttered. Nothing worse than that. Tony chuckled at her comment. I doubt it, Kellen. Lauren and I will pick you up on Friday at yours, say 7. Michael will apparently pick up Ray Ray and meet us there with his parents, though I did offer to pick him up along with you. He stated it was not necessary and wanted to pick Ray Ray up himself. All right, the dress code I imagine is formal. Proper attire will be required. Lauren has booked a table at Nillenway. Kellen gave a low whistle. For the wealthy only, I see. Making a statement. Michael told her to book anywhere she wanted, his parents would be paying for dinner. So, yes, making a statement. It's going to cost them a pretty penny. Well, I suggest you get the most expensive thing on the menu and make them pay for it. Kellen laughed. Trust Lauren to book at Nillenway. She bet Lauren had to use her father's connections to get a table there on such short notice. Owned by the Jacobson Foundation and booked solid all year round, but Lauren being the current heiress to the Hill Foundation, a table would likely have been granted as soon as her father made the call. The Hill Foundation was everywhere and had fingers in many pies, so to speak. 7 it is, I'll dress nicely, she grinned at him cheekily. Yes, no short skirts, Kellen. He laughed and headed for the door, as he opened it. Oh, and if that dumbass's men harass you, I can have old man Hill send some goons, he stated calmly as he stepped out of her office, knowing full well they would have heard him. He was making a point. Old man Hill's goons, unfortunately, would be no match for these two. She liked it though, found it very amusing. Kellen smiled at the word goons. Such a word would not normally have left his lips, and there was no way he would actually do it. He couldn't hurt a fly and his morals wouldn't allow it either. Okay, she replied to him, following along with his game. Say hi to Grandpa Hill for me. She waved him off, trying not to laugh. He could be so funny sometimes. Kellen leaned on the door frame to her office and watched him go, a smile still on her face. Ray Ray's influence, Arya piped up. Definitely, Kellen thought goons would be a word she could see Ray Ray using. As for opening the door so Jackson and Stephen could hear his comment, there was no need. They would have been listening to the entire conversation, with their wolf hearing. They would not have missed a word even with the door closed, and she knew they were listening. It was probably why they were still here, spying on her, because he couldn't come himself. No short skirts. Ha, he knew her so well, that was her trademark. She loved the little short skirts she wore to the office. It threw other lawyers off guard, made them think she was just a pretty face, with no brains, and while they were busy ogling her long legs or trying to catch a glimpse of something else, she could safely slide a loophole or two to safeguard her clients. She was young and pretty, and most who didn't know her underestimated her. Because of the way she dressed, she was very easy on the eyes and human men were easily distracted. Eric didn't particularly approve of her dress code, except when he thought it was a good time to use it, like in her press conference. Once he had figured out that Derek was the triplets' father, he had offered himself up to annoy the man, to look all cozy and comfortable with her. He really was trying to bring out the man's angry side, so the short skirt for her press conference had actually been Eric's idea, and his hand on her and the whispering in her ear, all just a ploy to try and make him show to the world he was indeed an angry, violent man. When it was needed, Kellen owned a proper suit or 2 or 7. It all depended on what case she was working on, who she was representing, who she was up against and what judge she had to go in front of. Today she was dressed in a short white skirt that fit perfectly over her bottom and flared out in pleats for 4 inches past her bottom. She was wearing sheer stockings and black stilettos that matched her black chiffon cowl neck blouse that stopped at her waist right where her skirt started. If she stretched up for anything she would show skin. Her long brown hair was loose today in slight waves down her back, it reached to the bottom of her shoulder blades, and it was held off the left side of her face with a simple comb. Her green eyes turned to Jackson finally. He was watching her. She had never dressed like this when in the pack. Unmated males were a horny bunch and it would only have incurred unwanted attention to herself, and she had only ever had eyes for one wolf then. So she had stuck to the pack normal, tights or jeans and a t-shirt. They had probably never seen her dress like this, even on her 18th birthday when her family had hoped she would find her mate, and so had she. They had placed her in a knee-length A-line midnight blue dress, made from silk. She had looked beautiful, yes, but like a proper lady, not a ex-woman. Now she dressed to kill all the time, and why not? She was a vibrant woman. She now lived and worked in the human world and no human could overpower her. She'd had a few sleazeballs try, and Kellen had let Arya put them firmly in their place and in the hospital. So, nowadays she wore what made her feel XY and desirable, something she craved to feel. He stood, as did Stephen. They were both smiling about something, genuine amusement on their faces. They'd obviously been having a conversation via their mind link, not something she had tested out to see if she could do with them, right in front of her. She had been gone 6 years, it might not work anymore. She didn't know. Or they thought Tony's remark was an utter joke, which was the more likely of the two thoughts. No human could take on either of them, not with wolves ready to rip out and help at any minute, but she strongly doubted either of them would even need their wolves' assistance with humans. They were well trained in hand-to-hand combat, as was she, but they still probably trained every day back in the pack. Chapter 16. Kellen Poi. Kellen leaned away from the door frame. She slid her hand down her body slowly and brushed imaginary dust from the bottom of her skirt. Jackson's eyes followed the movement automatically. Stephen reached out and cracked him up the back of the head, with quite a hard hit, causing him to growl slightly. His eyes glazed over, as did Stephen's, for maybe 15 seconds. When his eyes returned to her, she laughed out loud and winked playfully at Jackson. It was time to play. She thought this could be fun. She hadn't played with either of them in a long time, and now she was a fully fledged and unmated female wolf. She could flirt with whoever she wanted. She internally chuckled to herself. Game on. Jackson had used to stare at her sometimes. She had caught him a few times and he'd always cleared his throat and turned away or walked away. She'd noticed his interest in her since she was 16, the minute she had gotten Arya, but he'd never done anything about it. Neither had she. Her eyes had already been elsewhere. She wondered if he'd know about her interest in their alpha, and that was why he'd never acted on his interest in her. She waved them into her office and made sure to accidentally on purpose misstep and bump into Jackson, as he walked past her, her hand landing right on his HP as if to steady herself, her other hand on his muscular chest. Oops, so sorry. She smiled up at him all innocent-like, his entire body stilled, his grey eyes turned to hers. She leaned away from him, sliding her hand off of his chest slowly, but allowed the one on his HP to linger a few seconds longer, pressing in to feel the V-line she knew was right there as she stared up into his grey eyes. She saw his eyes darken slightly, and Kellen knew he was still attracted to her in some way. Stephen the spoilsport spoiled the moment by pushing Jackson through the doorway roughly, and Kellen walked in after him. She caught the disapproving frown on Stephen's handsome face. his caramel brown eyes hard on her, almost a warning in them, she thought. "So what do I owe the honor of your company for?" she asked, closing her office door. "Have a seat." She indicated the chairs in front of her desk. Oh, how sweet this was. They both outranked her in the pack, and yet here in her office in the human world she could tell them what to do and when. She got to sit behind the desk and they in front of it like good little warriors. Oh, such a sweet feeling. She must savor it. The smile on her face was friendly, and the nonchalant way she leaned her chin on her hand on her desk told them she wasn't afraid of them. Kellen Jackson stated flatly, "You cannot entertain the idea of going to another pack." Straight to the point, she thought. "Can't one?" she wondered aloud. "Why not?" she questioned him. "You know why," he shot right back at her, raising an eyebrow at her as if to imply she was faking the reason not to know why. She got his meaning. Kellen allowed herself to lean back in her chair and take in her once childhood friend. He didn't look all that much older, his jawline was more defined now, his skin was just as tanned as before from years of training out in the open sun. He clearly still worked out, his shoulders broader and his chest was definitely bigger and harder, she'd felt that herself. His V-line appeared to be deeper now too, than when she had trained with him, all muscle and good looks. His light brown hair was a little longer than she remembered, but she decided it suited him, his light grey eyes as clear and direct as ever. She could see Apollo behind them watching her, there was a flicker of green in them now, he was taking her in as she was him. She winked playfully right at his wolf. "Hey Apollo." She acknowledged his presence with a seductive smile playing about her lips. A light, almost playful growl came from him. Jackson punched himself in the chest lightly and cleared his throat, pulling his wolf into line. She heard Stephen snap his name and turned her green eyes on him while she chuckled at Apollo's response to her. Interesting. Her smile for him was just the same, quite playful, and hinted of teasing seduction, but his eyes were hard and unyielding on her. He too was more defined, not as broad-shouldered as the beta, but still noticeably bigger than when she had been 20, his skin a shade darker in its tan, and his jaw very square and set, his jet black hair, shaved short on either side and longish on top, styled with gel and set swooped off to the right. He had definitely turned into a hot specimen of a wolf, though she could see he was not interested in the slightest. No flirting with this one, and Rafe was not near the surface either. "I can actually. Any wolf can leave one pack for another, if the other pack is willing to take them in." She picked up the stack of messages Jordan had handed her this morning and waved them at him, returning her attention to Jackson, "And it seems, there are plenty willing to offer me a place too. You don't know how dangerous it will be for you and your pups, Kellen." "I've a fair idea," she nodded, "but better than the alternative, considering how much my current alpha hates me." Stephen sighed. "Kellen, honey." His voice oozed gamma charm. She hated it instantly. "He doesn't hate you, I assure you." He leaned forward. "Take the chance to mediate with him." His soft tone now had a sudden slight southern accent and was making Arya practically lay down and roll over. She wanted nothing more than to listen to his every word and fulfill them. "Stop that crap!" Kellen shot at him, annoyed, knowing full well he was using his goddess-gifted gamma charm to attract all her wolf's attention. She may not find him attractive or desirable, but gammas could sweet-talk any she-wolf. It was a gift to calm Lunas under times of stress, to get them to comply when they didn't want to run when their mate was in trouble and wanted her out of harm's way, when they were dying or dead and the gamma had to save their Luna's life from another alpha or his men, to protect her. They could use all that charm to sway even the most distraught wolf to get up and move. To take their hand and run away from trouble, even when grief overwhelmed them completely, they would listen and comply, and Arya was no exception to the rule, so it seemed. Stephen smiled at her, he knew exactly what he was doing and doing it on purpose. Ah, that was why he was here instead of back in the pack protecting his actual Luna. He was here to try and make her comply using the gift the goddess had blessed him with. Kellen, honey, what harm could it do one meeting on your terms? He practically drawled with that slight southern accent coming out of him now in deeper undertones. He was really trying to get to her. Wolf. We should. Arya whined at her. She was lying in Kellen's mind, all submissive and calm, ready to comply with his will. Kellen was just as stubborn as he was and forced Arya to the far reaches of her mind with a great effort. Glaring at Stephen, she took a long drawn and deep breath, to help steel herself against that goddess-gifted gamma charm, and turned away from him on purpose, losing eye contact with him, hoping to refocus her mind on Jackson and pull herself back to normal, or it would be all over for her. I will hear all offers and make a decision myself. You will have no say or influence on my decision. She bit out the last 4 words, still trying to fight that charm. Not looking at him was better, focusing on something else was better. She could feel herself starting to come back to her normal self. Or he had let go of her, stopped using his gift on her for the moment. More likely that was it. Jackson was glaring at her. Do you even know who our Packy's in alliance with? At war with? Who are our enemies? He shot at her. How could you be so stupid as to entertain anything any other pack offers? Kellen was now glaring back at him. She was not stupid, and of course, she knew there were many risks to her and her babies, as did Arya, but what choice did they have? He had dragged her back and hadn't even cared about the injuries she'd sustained, just stared at her with those furiously angry eyes of his. If the feds hadn't turned up, she would probably be dead or in a dungeon somewhere in pack territory. Fortunately, she was fully ensconced into the human world, where the people around her noticed she was missing and cared about her enough to report it and take action for her. I should just roll over and comply to the Alpha, she snapped right back at him, after what he did to me. Kellen opened the top drawer to her desk and pulled out the stack of photos full of her injuries and threw them on the desk in front of the two of them, showing just how bloodied and injured she had been: the bruising from being strangled and manhandled, the red raw marks from the silver handcuffs, the bruise and puncture wound from the needle that had been used to forcibly inject wolfsbane into her. The worst of the worst, she shot at him, heart lacing every word. I made one mistake in my entire life, and that's all he can think about even all these years later. I'm sure the Luna healed quickly enough, not a scar would have been left on her face. One hit and this was worth all my injuries, the trauma of being kidnapped, drugged, and separated from my babies. I bet that wasn't even the worst to come. Just the beginning. I saw how he was looking at me, still so angry for just one hit to his mate 6 years ago, not to mention that she hit me first. Stephen had picked up the photos and was frowning down at them. She had been running away when he had joined Jackson, coming to help capture her, probably hadn't seen the full state of her injuries. Jackson, on the other hand, had seen it all. It was one slap. Was it really worth anything she had been given? Jackson ran his hand through his hair roughly. Kellen, it wasn't like that. As for the men who hurt you, I had sent them and they were instructed not to harm you at all. Did I look unharmed to you, Jackson? She yelled angrily at him. You started the fight, I believe, in the back of the van. If you hadn't, you would not have sustained any injuries at all. I'll assure you. Was Elle just supposed to let some strange wolves drag me away to beat and probably me, Jackson, multiple times before being handed over? Of course, I was going to defend myself, any wolf would. Kellen, no harm was going to come to you, he repeated firmly. But I didn't crow that. Worst of the worst. That means that those who come for you, can do as they please, no matter what, and there will be no repercussions because the one who ordered it doesn't give a damn. As long as the detainee is actually alive and still breathing, they don't care about the state of said detainee. Isn't that correct? Anger laced every word. She knew she was correct, she knew that he also knew it. He was just angry, Kellen, that you were defying his request to come home, and the minute he knew you had called, he was very sorry for his words and rescinded them, but wouldn't pick up the phone and let me explain or reassure you. So you need to take some responsibility here too. I need to take responsibility. Are you insane? I was coming in. I'd made the arrangements, but did he care? No, he didn't. I am not responsible. Get out, she yelled, her anger starting to boil over. Arya was up and forefront in her mind, ready for a fight. They had complied and he'd wanted to send the worst of the worst. She was standing now, her hands on her desk, her claws were out, digging into the wood of her desk, Arya pulling forward. Jackson stood. Calm down, he said softly, trying to placate her. I won't, she growled, allowing him to see Arya right there ready to fight him. Okay, maybe I was wrong. His hands were raised defensively in a gesture that showed he didn't want to fight with her. Stephen got up, dropping all the photos, and stepped between them. Out, he said softly to Jackson, I'll talk to her. Kellen watched as Jackson pushed something into Stephen's hand. Make sure she knows, he said, and walked away out of her office and closed the door behind him. That left her alone with Stephen, and she could already feel his calming aura radiating off of him. Damn Gamma, she was spoiling for a fight and Jackson could take the brunt of it. All flirtatious thoughts were now gone, where he was concerned. Please, Kellen honey, sit down. Stephen said softly, slowly walking around the desk towards her. She could feel her anger starting to ebb away. Her eyes were on his and his directly looking at her. She and Arya both watching him carefully, waiting for something, anything. He technically was the enemy or belonged to her. Alpha and Goddess only knew what his orders were, where she was concerned. Please. Kellen honey, sit down, he repeated softly, and she couldn't help it. Her body sank down into the chair. Just relax. I'm not here to harm you in any way. His voice was barely above a whisper, all his gamma charm falling over her in full force, and she realized just how little he had used on her before to make Arya submit. I hate you. Kellen murmured, as Arya submitted and lay down. He chuckled, not offended in the least. That's okay right now. His eyes lit with amusement. His hands moved to the arms of her chair and he turned her to face him directly, leaned down and looked right at her, mere inches away from her face, his caramel eyes soft on her. She actually felt like he truly cared about her at this moment. Stupid Gamma, she hissed at him, all the fight going out of her. Yes, I'm the Gamma, he smiled right at her. You're Gamma, so please listen to me. No. She closed her eyes and shook her head. I don't want to, she whispered, knowing it was a losing battle but still trying desperately to fight it. Kellen, honey. Yes you do. His mouth was right there against her ear. Please don't make any rash decisions. He placed a piece of paper in her hand. Read this, take it very seriously. She nodded her head, opened her eyes, and he was right in front of her, staring right into her eyes. It felt like her very soul. I'll know you're hurting right now, Kellen, and need time. Take the time, just please give us a chance to. That is all I am asking of you. Tears filled her eyes. I hate you. She whispered again. She was drowning in his gamma charm aura. He smiled softly at her, placed a light kiss on her forehead. Just breath, he said softly, and stepped away from her, dropped his gamma charm. He walked towards the door, his hand on the handle, and turned to look at her. Have a nice dinner on Friday. He winked at her, and then was Jean from her office. She felt the weight of his gamma charm lift the minute he stopped using it and was starting to feel better and more her normal self with every minute that he was out of her office. Her eyes hardened and she glared at the door where he had been. Have a nice dinner on Friday. He was just letting her know that he knew exactly where she was going to be, and would likely be reporting as much to the Alpha. She took several minutes to recover her composure from the effect he'd had on her. She felt real sorry for his mate. The poor creature never stood a chance against that power. She was never going to be able to stay mad at him. Her eyes turned to the paper in her hand. She unfolded it. Read it. There was a list of pack names. At the top were the words "none of these enemies," she guessed. Along with the pack names were the names of the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta of each pack. Kellen guessed that was just in case they tried to fool her. She didn't quite understand why. They had given it to her, and stated none of these almost implied she was going to be allowed to get a new pack. Were they actually starting to believe she was going to be able to find a new pack? Preparing for it, she supposed, she could reject her pack any time she liked, and go rogue. Perhaps he would rather know where she went with his children than just disappear with them, which she could. She guessed. 3 of those packs were right out there in her waiting area. She would take it seriously. She did not want harm to come to her babies, or her and Arya either. She got up after putting the paper away in her desk drawer. Walked over and brought in her next appointment. He introduced himself, smiling politely, and sat down. Seemed nice. He didn't even look her over, as most male wolves would. Could be mated, but his mark spot was currently covered, so she didn't know. He handed her an envelope. It had the Eclipse pack seal on it. My Alpha sends an offer of friendship and an invitation into our pack. Delta Ryan. Kellen opened the letter and read it. It was addressed directly to her and offered sanctuary and protection to her and her 3 pups until they were to turn 18. He offered her a position in his pack's legal department along with a nice-sized salary attached. An accommodation in the pack house itself on the Gamma's floor. A full suite for her and the children. All she had to do was pledge allegiance to him and swear her loyalty and her children's as well, and then he would take her in and protect her from her current Alpha and all threats from the Crimson Ridge pack. It was a nice offer, but all she saw was the deadline for the protection of her children at 18. After that they could simply do as he pleased and harm her and the children. Do whatever he wanted to them. No, she was not so stupid. She looked up at Delta Ryan. Only till my children turn 18, why? I didn't write it. Ryan stated with a simple shrug, I was only instructed to deliver it and await your reply. I'm currently fielding many offers. She indicated the stack of message slips on her desk. You should return to your pack. Tell your Alpha, thank you for the offer. I will consider it. However, an expiry date on protection and sanctuary is a turn-off. I want complete assurance no harm will, ever, come to me or my children. I seriously doubt you'll get that from any pack. He nodded and stood up. My Alpha, however, does have a son about 3 years older than your girls. Perhaps a mating bond alliance could be a better offer. No, Arya roared in her head. Kellen agreed totally. She would not sell off one of her children to any man or wolf. The goddess would gift her children mates, and only then would she allow any of them to be bonded to another. There would be no chosen mates for her babies. Certainly not one from an enemy pack. Perhaps she bowed her head slightly, showing respect. She did not want to offend this man or his Alpha. I will let my Alpha know, was all Ryan said before leaving her office. Kellen shuddered. She felt as though grubs were crawling all over her skin. Are all offers going to be like this? She hoped not. Chapter 17. Derek POV. He was disappointed to hear how Jackson had handled Kellen. Jackson was usually very diplomatic in his business dealings. He thought sending him to deal with her was a good idea, due to the man's feelings towards her. Not that he had yet to say anything about having feelings for her, but Derek was sure if he didn't have them then, once he had done, which should have made him handle her gently, not try and get her to take some responsibility for her injuries. He had been totally disappointed and hurt by her words about him, but at least now he understood why she ran away. She believed he hated her. How she felt about him at this current moment didn't sit well with him. Havoc was pissed off about it, but again Derek reassured him that when they came face to face everything would work out. It would all be okay. Havoc muttered something about mating Arya, whether she liked it or not, until she submitted to him completely. Derek didn't totally approve of that, but wolves would do what they wanted. The human counterpart couldn't always control them, and he doubted very much Havoc would be relinquishing control the minute he spotted Arya. She was his mate and nothing was going to stop him from mating her. It also gained him some insight. She was still unaware that his mating bond was broken, so she was indeed in for a shock when she laid eyes upon him. Thankfully, Stephen had been there. He had handled her very well indeed. She was very susceptible to his gamma qualities. That was good, though he had mentioned she put up quite a good bit of resistance to it. On his first use, forcing her wolf away to try and beat him at his own game, he had relented and let go. He'd just been testing her. But, had used all of it to stop what was going to be a full-blown wolf-on-wolf fight between her and Jackson, right in earshot of 3 of their enemy packs. He had even called her his gamma, not something he should have done without permission, but she hadn't thought anything of it, as far as Stephen could tell. Just presumed he meant it in a roundabout way due to the fact that he was the pack's gamma, though Derek knew that was not what Stephen meant. He literally was her gamma and he obviously wanted her to hear it, know it, maybe even sense it. Those enemy pack members would have heard the heated discussion between the 3 of them and now they all understand she does not want to have anything to do with their pack. He had no idea of what they made of Stephen's little faux pas. He could only hope they took it the same way Kellen did. Hearing the oscillation from her office with he own pack beta, they will be likely to make better offers to entice her. It was clear his most hated rival packs were the first to come out of the woods to try and win her. They were indeed trying to get to him via his children. He could only hope they never found out she was his mate. That Stephen hadn't let it out of the bag and endangered her. Stephen had advised that they leave after the meeting, so Kellen didn't get into it again with Jackson when coming out of her office. They had stayed close by though, with enemy pack members right there. They would not leave her alone, and he had ordered tighter security on the triplets and her apartment building. They had been a little on the reserved side during the video call and he knew something else had happened, but they were holding it back. He knew it, asked them what it was. Laksun had literally looked guilty and not been able to make eye contact with him. Dread had filled him almost instantly. Had he actually hurt her, he'd wondered. Stephen had sighed and muttered, "I'll tell him then, shall and proceeded to inform him of Kellen's flirting with Jackson and his wolf, Apollo, and Apollo's reaction to her. Havoc had not liked it at all, but Derek had burst out laughing. He had not expected her to play that tactic, but when he thought about it, why wouldn't she try to throw them off guard? If she had any idea that Jackson had any kind of feelings for her, of course she would. She was a she-wolf and a very beautiful one, with mischief built into her genes. She'd always played games with them. When he and she had been in their casual relationship, she would run and hide behind Jackson to get away from him when he was stalking her playfully, looking to bed her, sometimes climbing on his back and begging him to save her from the big bad alpha who was trying to RASTRE her and steal her virtue, lol, that had been lost long before. Cheeky minx. Jackson had played along sometimes and ran off with her on his back. Leaving Derek to chase after the 2 of them, very playful banter, he'd always catch them, toss her over his shoulder and run off with her towards his room, growling out in playful tones, "You're mine now, little she-wolf." His laughter had surprised both of them. He simply explained that it was no different to her behavior when they had been going out, running to Jackson to have him save her. She was trying to appeal to his nature to help her out. He was not concerned at all. He actually wasn't. He didn't think Jackson would do anything to hurt him or enrage his beast. Let alone something that would get him kicked out of the pack or killed. His friend might like the future Luna, but Derek was certain the man would not act on it. She was hot, his destined mate. If she was, he would have claimed her long ago, before she had seduced her alpha with those jewel green eyes of hers, that night when she'd been 19. It had crossed his mind as to whether Jackson had been hoping she was his fated mate at one point. She was one of their closest friends, and it had surprised all of them that none of them had wound up mated to her. The day she had been presented on her 18th birthday, he could recall her beauty. None of them had seen her dressed like that makeup on either. Most of the time they saw her in jeans and t-shirts or training clothes, covered in mud. They'd all seen her. Nothing unusual about that. She was a fierce fighting machine, as were they, and so when there had been rogue attacks, she had joined in on the fighting against them. And so they had all seen her shift. Jackson had actually been wearing nice clothing. On the day of her 18th birthday, he recalled dark blue slacks and a pale blue short-sleeved dress shirt, though he had still been leaned back casually against the wall next to his parents' table, looking bored as usual, playing it cool. Derek had wondered then if it was due to wanting to be her mate. She had looked very uncomfortable that day, being presented as all pack members were at 18 to see if their fated mate was within the pack. Actually, she hadn't looked around at all, simply stood next to Alpha Blaine and stared directly ahead into the forest, not searching the crowd as many ID looking for the one they were hoping to be their mate, praying to the goddess that they too would be looking at them. Nope, not his Kellen, stubborn always. Defiant even to the goddess, it seemed. Well, she had a fated mate now, she just didn't know it yet. But would soon enough. He had to find a way to get her to willingly come home to the pack. Or into the state where his pack was, or he was going to have to breach the human restrictions placed on him where she was concerned, and he was truly trying to abide by them so she could see he respected her. This was the only reason he had stayed put. He wanted her to come to him on her own terms. He was hoping the mediation would work, but no, she had stubbornly refused it. The next thing Jackson had relayed to him had shocked him, but also was going to go in his favor, or at least he hoped so. He was now patiently waiting for the outcome. And they had snapped a few shots of her coming and going from the office. She looked stunning in her little skirt, though he was still unhappy about her wearing it where all eyes were on her, especially while she was entertaining offers from his enemy packs. He was going to have a serious talk to her about her dress code when she came home. XY for him was one thing, but in front of the whole pack, no. He had also received new pictures of the triplets at their school. His son was very protective of his sisters, just like a good alpha, though he was a little concerned about the anger he displayed when anyone hurt one of the girls, even accidentally. His men watching the triplets had reported that one of the twins had been bumped into by another child running past playing with other children and fallen off her seat. His boy had picked her up off the ground, made sure she was all right, and then ran after the children and shoved them over quite violently and yelled at them to watch what the heck they were doing or he'd beat them up. Apparently, the twins hadn't reacted much to it, just watched him, probably normal behavior that they always saw, coming to their defense, but it would have to be curbed. Did Kellen even know about it? He wondered, and if so, did she discuss it with him and try to discourage it? In a pack school, you could expect it from a male alpha child that had a twin sister or brother even, whichever was the more dominant would become the protector and display such behavior, but in the human world he didn't think it would be acceptable. He could have Jackson or Stephen bring it up with her later this week and see how she was handling it. Though how she would take him, trying to give parental advice, when he'd never had anything to do with them, when she had raised them all by herself, was another matter. Was he overstepping his bounds in this matter? Was it too early? No. Havoc stated. Ours. Yes, they were his, but he'd never even known about them, and if the roles were reversed, would he want someone who he thought hated him giving parental advice? He doubted it very much. Even if it was out of concern, it would be like an intrusion. He was in two minds about interfering at this point, but he was worried about the boy's aggression. Did he have Havoc's temper? Derek felt Havoc snort. Ain't nothing wrong with me. No, let's just go around ripping heads off at will, buddy. Only one time, he snarled right back him, and the ripping and tearing and killing of things when you're mad. Normal, I'm the alpha wolf. Derek shook his head. There was no reasoning with his wolf. He hadn't always been destructive, yes, aggressive and forceful, but that was normal for an alpha wolf. His sudden change of temperament had come from a betrayal that had hurt him so badly he had not known how to cope with it. That thought made him wonder just how Arya felt, if she was too an angry wolf at this point, and what would it take to subdue her if that was the case. She would have been just as hurt as Jala that day, though he was certain now Kara had reacted to protect her pups. He had no idea if Kellen had known about them at the time. She would have told him, he was certain of it. They had been in bed together enjoying each other very much, the very day before he had met Sophia. So he could only presume Arya had just figured it out but had yet to tell Kellen. He called Jackson and asked him to bring it up with her. Jackson was quiet on the subject but didn't decline altogether, so Derek told him if he was uncomfortable to have Stephen do it, but it had to be done before the boy actually hurt someone. He also requested a copy of their birth certificates so he could get them enrolled into the pack school here right away. He had yet to tell his pack about Kellen or his pups, but he knew some had figured it out, mostly the ones that worked in the human world and had seen his press conference, though none of them had come to him or passed it around the pack. They all knew better than to piss off his wolf, who had a very short fuse and an explosive temper. When he half-shifted, the place reeked fear. On the bright side, that he could half-shift and maintain it was currently keeping the attacks on his pack to a minimum. It seemed even his enemies had become weary of him. He hoped Kellen and Arya wouldn't get to see it any time soon. He didn't need either of them any more afraid of them than they already were. Havoc snorted, just makes us look stronger. Is that what you think? Arya will like it. Havoc rumbled, wolves like strong mates all the better to protect them, hey. Derek smiled at Havoc's thought process. He really believed Arya was going to love him no matter what, that she would have no problem with his temper, dominant behavior, halt-shifting ability, or reputation. He has some serious faith in his mate. Considering how he thought he was going to mate her, by force without permission, until she completely submitted to him, Derek had some serious doubts that it was going to go smoothly, probably a massive wolf fight out in the woods, hopefully in the woods and not in the Alpha Suite, where everything would get destroyed. He, on the other hand, was going to use every seductive tactic he knew. Where Kellen was concerned, he would tread carefully and make sure she was completely willing. It wasn't like they had never been in bed before. But this time would be very different. It would have a completely different meaning to it, not just a fun romp between the sheets, but a meaningful lifelong commitment to fun romp between the sheets. But a meaningful lifelong commitment to each other. It would also feel very different. Beway. more heated, and both their arousal levels would be higher and their need for each other would increase at some point, and the desperate need to mate furiously would take over, and his dominant need to possess her utterly and completely would get the better of him, and he would just pound the living out of her. "Will Mark Deep Havoc murmured. "We will indeed, everyone will know she is mine, ours." Derek agreed he would bite hard, his venom burning into her so much she would never get away from him. She would mark him back the same way he hoped. Chapter 18. Kellen POV. She was standing in front of Jordan's desk staring at the message in her hand. It read, "Shadow Crest Industry CEO Austin White would like to personally discuss affiliation. Approved by your grandmother, Clara." Clara was her mother Vera's mother, and she did actually reside in the Shadow Crest Pack. Kellen recalled visiting when she was little girl with her mum and brother. It was probably the only honest offer she had received so far. Her grandmother must be worried about her, not only that she had just learned she was a great-grandmother as well. This could be the thing that saves her. "Jordan, call Mr. Austin White back and make an appointment with him. If he's not available to come here, I will go to him. I'm free next weekend." "Yes, Kellen," he nodded. "Let me know right away and give me the number too." She watched him write it down and took it, added it to her phone right away. Was about to walk into her office when she smelled them. She had been so involved in her thoughts that Jackson and Stephen were able to sneak up on her. Well, they didn't sneak, took great pleasure in reminding her they were watching her all day every day. "Kellen, may we speak to you?" Jackson asked almost politely. "About that? I'm expecting Eric Stanton any minute now, and he won't take kindly to the two of you being here, considering who you work for." "I really don't care." Jackson shrugged. "I wasn't charged or court-ordered to stay away from you." "What can he do?" "Really?" His smile was smug. "Add a harassment charge to Derek's list of crimes." "For sending you?" Jackson seemed unfazed. "It'll all get resolved when you come home, Kellen." "Which you will do." She looked right at him and laughed softly. "Well, considering Elle just got a real valid offer of affiliation, I don't see that happening." She felt it, anger filling the air around him. It was coming off of both of them now, and she stared at them a little wide-eyed. Why were they so surprised or even angry about that? They had to know it was coming sooner or later. They were aware she was entertaining offers after all. "What pack?" Jackson practically snarled at her, forgetting he was not in Wolfen society but the human world. She guessed, Apollo was right there on the surface. She saw Jordan shrink back in his chair in an effort to get away from him. Austin White will be calling himself to make an offer in person. He was thinking, his mind ticking away. Did he know Alpha Austin? She wondered. Kellen couldn't recall much about him. She had only been little. Jackson was frowning deeply at her, and she wondered if he knew of her blood relation to the Shadow Crest Pack, or if the Crimson Ridge Pack was aligned with her grandmother's pack. Breaking into her chain of thought was Jordan. "Kellen, Mr. White is on the line for you now. I put it through to your office, line 1. "Oh, thank you, Jordan." She nodded to him, completely surprised that he was taking the time to personally speak with her on such short notice, and turned to walk into her office. She went to close the door only to have Jackson force it open and step right through, followed by Stephen. Whatever she thought, she had more important things to sort out than them. She picked up the phone. "Alpha Austin, thank you so much for taking my call on such short notice." "My pleasure, dear Kellen. Your grandmother was very concerned and brought your plight to my attention, and has asked me to extend an offer to you." "Thank you." She was surprised by his straightforward and direct remark, probably very busy and needed to get to the point, to attend to other business for the day. "I was going to drop by, but seeing as you called back so quickly, let's just get this sorted out right away, shall we? LD like to offer you protection for you and your pups. I was more than disappointed by the treatment you received from your current alpha. I will certainly never treat you in such a manner. I'd appreciate that, truly I would, she said in all honesty. Seeing as you already have a blood connection to my pack and Clara is offering her home to you and your pups, I don't mind at all. You may come and see the Shadow Crest pack at your convenience and, if you like it, I'll initiate you and the pups in. That simple. She was more than shocked now, and a little relief was flowing through her. Perhaps she should have just gone right to her grandmother when she had been banished, but being too distraught at the time, she hadn't thought about it, just pushed it all down and tried to focus on her degree and then raising her pups. Yes. I will not try to sway you, as I'm sure others are doing at this moment. I will also never hurt you or your pups. That is not what I am about, I assure you. You will all be safe here for as long as you are here with us, protection guaranteed. We are a strong pack, 80% warriors and well respected by other packs. I am also on the Alpha Council, so my word may be trusted. Think it over. It is an open invitation to come if you want to. If you choose me. Wow, he was very direct and Kellen didn't hear a single ounce of anything other than honesty in his voice. Thank you again Alpha Austin, I will visit very soon. Anytime he repeated, and then disconnected the line. Jackson was staring at her practically fuming. He looked as though he was about to launch himself at her and forcibly drag her away and back to his pack. She felt Arya push forward at the threat they were feeling. Stephen was suddenly between them, a hand outstretched to each of them. Everybody calm down, he said softly, flooding the room with his gamma charm. He knew there was about to be a full-blown wolf-on-wolf fight right here in her office. In the human world, things were rapidly getting out of hand. Right at that moment, Eric Stanton chose to open her office door and walk in. He took stock of the situation and snapped, "Who let you in here?" and walked towards Kellen. Jackson's reaction was instant. He spun on his heel and stepped right into the man's face, still all anger and aggression. Apollo right there on the surface, and Kellen thought he was going to rip into him, her eyes wide. "Back off," he grated out, his beta aura forcing Eric to actually step backwards several steps. "This is private." Kellen sighed with relief. Jackson was still in control enough to realize this was not the time or place. Arya backed down. "It's all right Eric, I'm fine. Can you please give us a few minutes?" she asked calmly. Eric didn't take his eyes off of Jackson, but nodded slowly. "5 minutes then I am calling security," he stated flatly, only a trace of fear he must be feeling showing in his voice. Then he left the room. Jackson banged the door closed behind him and she watched him turn towards her. "I asked what pack, Kellen, and I expect an answer," he snapped, all beta aura flowing out of him. She steeled herself against it and said, "I'm not giving you one. I have the right to protect myself." "Yes you do." Stephen nodded, his eyes were also on Jackson, though not on hers. He was trying to control the situation at hand, she thought. Control the beta? Unlikely, she thought. Jackson outranked him. If it was a physical fight, Gamma Beta Kellen was betting on the beta. Besides, she had trained with them all, she knew Jackson would win. Only Derek could take him down. "It's fine Jackson, she is not going anywhere today, got that dinner on Friday night and has court Monday to Wednesday. Calm down also, I do not think her own grandmother would mean her any harm, the offer is likely genuine." How did he know she had court next week? So they were not only watching her, they were spying and prying on her as well, not just at home but in her working life too. Bastards! Jackson seemed to regain some of his composure and Apollo receded. Fine, then we need to discuss why we actually came today. You go ahead. If I lose it, blame the she-wolf. Kellen sighed, she-wolf. She had a name and he knew it. Her eyes moved to Stephen. What did you come for? There was an incident at the triplets' school. Young Nate pushed over another boy and threatened him. So? He was protecting his sisters is all. The school had called her, she had apologized and told them he was just a bit super sensitive due to her recent killing and attack, that he needed an adjustment period. The school had complied and given him leeway this time but stated that it was not to happen again. She had promised them she would talk to him. Kellen had words with him, but he'd folded his arms across his chest and told her he would protect them no matter what. Such a good boy, typical alpha genes. She'd had to remind him that, due to what he was naturally stronger and needed to remember he could easily hurt a human child without trying if he wasn't careful. Also, told him he needed to learn the difference between an accident and an on-purpose bump or running into of his sisters. She had not chastised him, just gently reminded him one day he would be like her and Arya and have a wolf with enormous strength. That she wanted him to be careful and responsible for his actions. Not to let his anger get the better of him. He had huffed at her and she had reminded him to breathe and count to 10 before charging off in anger, to look at the situation and determine the right course of action, think about what the outcome would be if he was to solely act on his anger. She didn't want him to be like his father, filled with rage and anger over the smallest of things. That's it. You're not going to do anything about it? Stephen asked, seemingly concerned by her lack of concern. What's it to you how I'll deal with my son? She spat at him. The alpha is concerned about the amount of aggression that has been reported, is all. So her anger building, he thinks he has the right to stalk my children, does he, to tell me how to raise them? He knows nothing about them. Has no rights as far as I am concerned, and whose fault is that Kellen? Jackson snapped from where he stood, still over by the door. She shot back. It was him, Jackson, who Alpha ordered me to leave and never, ever come back. You should have told him before you left, he stated flatly, still implying it was her fault. Tell him something I didn't know, how is that possible? I didn't find out until after I had left the pack. That was technically true. It might have only been minutes after she left, but still after she had left, after she had been banished. You still could have called and told him. Or Alpha Blaine at least. Oh, could Elle, and what would the then future Luna have done to me, to my pups? She watched as he ran his hand through his hair but said nothing. She knew she was right. Sophia would not have been happy about it or supported it. She and the pups would have been in danger. Your Luna would never have accepted them and I would have been in danger every day of her knowing. I did what I did for their very safety. And I will continue to protect them from your Alpha and Luna. Even if it means changing packs. Kellen, look. His voice softened. Enough. Stephen interrupted, glaring at Jackson. That was a bit odd. She thought, especially when Jackson actually stopped talking, taking an order from the Gamma. Stephen turned to her, do you need a hand with the triplets, Kellen? Is Nate too much to handle? That is all we need to know. No, he is fine and I did talk to him. He's just protective of his sisters is all, even more now, since I was kidnapped and, she left the statement unsaid. Right. If you need a hand just call one of us, okay, we'd be happy to help you out. He held out a pack card with all their details on it. She took it but knew she would not be using it, just a courtesy to make them leave peacefully, shrugged as if to say whatever and dropped it on her desk. Stephen turned to Jackson. Let's go. We came and did what was asked. Jackson was still frowning but nodded. I want to know when you intend to visit Alpha Austin's pack, Kellen. A protective detail will be organized so no harm will come to you or your pups. I don't want your protection, she replied firmly. Tough, he stated and walked out of her office. Stephen nodded to her. Please consider it, Kellen. Every time you're not with them they are at risk, even if it is small. Then he was gone, out of her office as well. Well, whose fault was that? Who put them in the spotlight for all of Wolfen society to see? Not her, that was for sure. She had kept them safe and sound and out of Wolfen society for their entire lives. His High and Almighty. I'm all-powerful, I can do as I please. Urifa, that was who. So do not blame us for that, assholes. She thought, annoyed. Eric walked in the minute they walked out. What were they doing here? I'm not wrong, they were two of the men at his press conference, right? He sounded very annoyed with her. Yes, there are his men, his right and left hands respectively. They are here on his request to check up on the triplets, now that he knows about them. Why all the yelling? It's normal, they work for him. Why would Elle be nice to them? She shrugged. Kellen, what is going on? It looks like you've been communicating with Mr. Browning without your lawyers present. Have you? No. He did try to yell at me over the phone, so Elle hung up. His men are here trying to convince me to do the mediation and keep an eye on his children. As far as I know, there is no actual threat at this point. Ls that what they are telling you? If they are here watching your children, that is a problem. I grew up with both of those men that were just here. They were once my best friends. I don't believe either one of them would hurt me or my children, just watching is all. That is called stalking, Kellen, and you know it. I can have them arrested and charged. Kellen sighed. This was the very reason she didn't want them here when Eric turned up to check on her. Perhaps it's better to just let them be for the time being. Placate him by letting him think he is getting what he wants. I will need to go away next weekend. Eric to visit my grandmother. She caught wind of all that is going on and is worried about me. She is with the Shadow Crest Industries. That got his attention. Does everyone you know? Kellen cut him off. Yes, everyone I know, from my past works or lives within the confines of some of the biggest corporations. She sighed. It was getting too close to the truth, and before you ask, no, I won't be trying to bring them in as a client for you, they have their own law firm. He stared at her for a long minute. This is not a simple thing, is it, Kellen? Did he really take you over a monetary debt? I honestly have no idea. I was only in his presence for maybe 3 or 4 very uncomfortable minutes. He was completely fuming with rage. It is all Elle got. Then his father interrupted. With your press conference, and I took the opportunity to run away, and got away, that is it. He never actually spoke to me other than to demand I look at him. She shrugged. She wasn't about to tell him she had been dragged back to be punished for that one slap. To his mate's taste. He was no fool and was starting to think money was not the motivation. He'd never find out the real reason. He was human and they Wolfen, and if he did and tried to out them he would be slaughtered before he could, and his body would likely never be found. He would simply just vanish without a trace from the human world. She had no idea what to do with him. Alpha Derek, she knew if she dropped the charges, would have her and her pups taken instantly and brought to him with just a phone call. So for now, the charges will have to stay in place. Once she was safely initiated into another pack, she could drop them. It's a losing battle, Arya piped up. He'll come at some point. Kellen knew this. it was just a matter of when, but probably not until he could assure his pup's safety from his current mate. Their very existence was a threat to her and her heirs, to his throne, so to speak. It's likely the triplets would be probably 6 to 12 months older if he and Sophia had pups right away. I know, we just need to wait. Next weekend we'll go and see grandmother and her pack. If all goes well, we'll simply stay. You sure? Arya sounded worried. Yes, and you'll finally be able to run free and at will. Kellen smiled at her. Okay, though she still felt a little reluctant to Kellen. We might find our mate. Kellen offered, hoping to cheer her up, and you'll be able to let the pups ride on your back. Arya chortled at that deal. It was something she always wanted to do. Her demeanor picked up right away. Good, let's think positively about our visit to grandmother's pack, okay? Okay, Arya settled down in her mind, but Kellen felt the lingering thought of havoc. She pushed it aside. Since his wolf had called to her, Arya had been having odd feelings, uncertain of what it was herself, but it was concerning. Kellen had tried to tell her it was just the alpha calling her to come home, for his pups, nothing more, but there was a feeling of uncertainty within Arya, and it was still with her. She knew as well as Arya that Havoc was not her fated mate. If he was, they wouldn't be in this situation. They would have marked and mated on her 18th birthday, and their pups would have been born in the pack. She gently reminded Arya of this now. Arya agreed, but still that lingering thought of Havoc stayed with her. It's just because he's the pup's father, Kellen reassured her now. Chapter 19. Kellen POV. Again they were waiting for her at her office. You know, one day I might not come to the office. We'd know, Jackson replied lazily. He was leaning up against the door to her office, appeared bored. This was how she remembered him from her days in the pack, laid back and easygoing, his normal stance. Get some, did we? She laughed. He was so relaxed, he must have, she thought to herself. He raised an eyebrow at her but said nothing. What do you want? You're out for dinner tonight? Stephen and I thought we could watch the children. No. Yes, Kellen, he said calmly, anything could happen to them while you're out for hours. Is that a threat, Jackson? She queried. He sighed, and shook his head. Kellen, you have known me your whole life. Do you think I would hurt your children, Derek's children? For that matter, he is my best friend. She noted the pause. He'd clearly been going to say Alpha, but had thought better of it with Jordan right at his desk. I was, to once, she shot back, but you sent those men after me at his command. She shrugged. You might take them. Stephen sighed heavily. Please don't fight, I hate getting in the middle of the two of you. One day I am gonna get injured if Elle can't control the pair of you and talk you down. He held his hand up to stop them both from replying to his comment. Look. Let's call a truce just for tonight. Kellen, you go out and have a nice dinner with Anthony and Lauren and Jackson, and I will assist your nanny. A win-win. Kellyanne stared at Stephen for a long minute. Could they be trusted, she wondered. A truce. She had no idea if that would even work, but she did know that they would never hurt her pups. Fine, but my rules and no arguing about them, period. Good, state your rules, Jackson said simply. I haven't thought about them yet, and she had barely had time to think past them wanting to watch her children in a babysitting capacity, but she would think some up at some point. He pushed off of her door and walked past her. We'll be at your apartment at 1830, half an hour before you get picked up. Fine. They were prompt. Jimmy buzzed her at exactly 1830 to let her know they were in the lobby. She had him send them up. Looked at Suzy. Don't let them in. Not even to use the bathroom. If they try to take the children, call the police right away and give them the address Elle gave to you and the names I wrote down. I wouldn't advise talking to them, especially Stephen. He will be all charming and be able to sweet talk out of you. Suzy chuckled at that, thought it was funny. Kellen sighed, poor Suzy. If they did get her to open the door, she was doomed to be attracted to both of them, and Kellen was certain Stephen would use his gamma charm on the girl to get inside the apartment for some reason. She just hoped they weren't going to do anything to her human nanny. It wasn't uncommon for wolves to fool around with humans if they weren't mated. Kellen waited outside her apartment, saw them get out of the elevator, both dressed very casually in jeans and t-shirts, shirts that were stretched and straining at their muscles. No, they were not going anywhere near her sweet Suzy. She'd never survive either one of them. They both walked over smiling at her. She did not smile back at them. Rules, she stated. 1. You will not go inside, you stay out here on door detail. 2. You will hand over your phones and I will put them inside the apartment, no photos of my children for him. 3. If you have to use the bathroom, there is one in the lobby, don't ask Suzy to let you in. 4. When I get home you leave without issue. Do you both understand? They were both frowning now, but Stephen nodded in agreement without hesitation. He even reached into his jeans back pocket and handed over his phone to her. Jackson seemed reluctant but did comply after 10 seconds and an elbow from Stephen. This is not assisting, Jackson stated flatly. No, it's guard duty. She smiled at them sweetly, but did not say what she was thinking, just what watchdogs are for. Arya snorted at her. Good one. Kellen returned to her apartment, reminded Suzy of the rules and not to let them in for any reason, then went and pulled on the dress she had laid out for dinner. A soft mint green silk dress that fell just below her knees. It was a fit and flare dress, hugged all her curves perfectly and then flared out from the H.P.S. to the hemline. She pulled on her white high heels and a white bolero jacket and headed out the door. Both Jackson and Stephen were leaning on the wall across from her door and openly stared at her. She saw as they both looked her up and down. Jackson gave a low whistle. Take a photo, it'll last longer, she shot at him. Can't you took away my phone? But please take one before you give it back. I'm sure I know someone who would love it. Make darned good use of it, if you know what I mean. Stephen laughed and punched him. Then as Kellen walked away, oh Kellen, you, have a nice dinner now, won't you? And she heard them both laugh. They all walked into Nillenway and as coats were being collected, Kellen's phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat. Please goddess, don't let me have trusted them just to have them kidnap my babies. I'll be just a minute, go on ahead, she told Tony and Lauren, and they were taken upstairs to their table. She answered the phone, which was indicating home on the screen. Hello? Mummy, can we have ice cream? Lily practically yelled down the phone at her. Kellen's heart settled instantly. They were all okay. Yes, of course you can, sweetheart, she heard Lily yell. Mummy said yes, and then the call was disconnected. Kellen chucked to herself. Arya chortled. Typical of her, babies getting what they want and run away. So cute though. She handed her bolero jacket over to the man patiently waiting for her to finish her call. She headed up the stairs after Tony and Lauren. Frowned the instant she got to the second floor. She could smell wolves and a very familiar scent at that. Glancing around the room, she saw Tony and Lauren just sitting down at a table across the other side of the room, and there at the table with them was Michael Browning and his parents, Alpha Blaine and Luna Darla. Just freaking great. She walked over to the table and looked at Ray Ray. Oh goddess, the way she was looking at Michael, she was his mate, a human mate. He had his hand in hers on the table, Kellen frowned right at it, and it suddenly dawned on her. The amused looks on Jackson and Stephen's faces when Tony had left her office that day, the comment about her going out to dinner, and, tonight when she'd left her apartment again, the comment "have a nice dinner," and then them, laughing. They knew she was going to be having dinner with her Alpha's extended family. Assholes! They would pay for this. She was also willing to bet that Derek himself knew about this, probably thought it was funny, getting a real kick out of it, she imagined. She did not, however, sit down. Her eyes glared at him. She honestly had nothing against any of the wolves there at that table, but Tony had told her Michael had heard of her, that his parents were happy for her to work on Ray Ray's prenup. Which meant she would have to deal with his family in person, and you can just bet they would be putting Derek in charge of dealing with it, which meant not just phone calls, but in-person meetings, and with him currently not allowed to leave his state, she would have to go to him. To the pack. "You son of a asterisk," she snapped at his smiling face. Kellen, she heard Alpha Blaine gasp at her tone. "Honey, what's wrong?" Lauren asked worriedly. "Do you know who they are?" She turned her eyes first to Lauren and then Tony. They both looked confused at her anger. "Kellen." Again Alpha Blaine, but this time she heard the clear warning in his tone, making sure she knew he wouldn't stand for her getting in the way of his son's mate bond. "This is the Browning family," she pointed right at Michael. "This is Derek Browning's younger brother, and those are his parents." She heard both Lauren and Tony gasp in shock, saw Ray Ray's eyes widen. It surprised Kellen to see Ray Ray suddenly pull her hand from Michael's and stare at him wide-eyed. This was completely new to her. He should have told her, given her some warning, but it seemed he had not. "Kellen, that is quite enough," Alpha Blaine stated, and she heard his tone loud and clear. He was ordering her to shut up. Michael's eyes had moved to his suddenly empty hand, and Kellen registered the instant distress in his expression as Ray Ray edged away from Hearn, fearing she was rejecting him, when less than 30 seconds ago she had been blissfully in love with Hearn. She could also smell a small amount of fear coming off of her. Ray Ray was like a little sister to her. And she had seen Kellen's state when she had been brought home and had cried and sobbed all over her. Babbling about how anyone could do that to a person was inhumane, that she hoped Derek would be sentenced to prison and locked up for a long time, beaten to within an inch of his life, so he knew how it felt. Now she was just realizing she was in love with that man's brother. It didn't appear to be going down so well with her. "Sit down," Alpha Blaine ordered her, and she sat with the weight of the order on he. She could not help it, no choice in the matter. "You will apologize. Michael has never done anything wrong. And Derek never laid a hand on you." He was angry. She could feel it now. She was ruining Michael's chance with his fated mate, and Alpha Blaine wouldn't stand for it. He could see Ray Ray's reaction to the news, as well as her parents. Both Lauren and Tony were reaching for Ray Ray to move her away from Michael. Kellen knew if she did ruin this, Alpha Blaine and Luna Darla would never forgive her. She had thought Alpha Blaine could be trusted, but she guessed not. He was, after all, Derek's father. What more could she expect from him, other than taking his own son's side? "This is not about you, Kellen, this is about Michael and Ray Ray's bond and marriage to each other. Don't screw it up, I am warning you," he shot at her through the mind link. It hit her like a hot knife searing into her brain. She hadn't even known if she still had the ability to use it anymore, being gone for so long. Clearly he could, and with great force. Her head was actually now aching from the force he had used on her. A mate bond was sacred, especially a goddess-gifted one. She didn't want to be here, couldn't be here, would only screw everything up royally, and she wouldn't be able to help herself. She stood and left almost at a run, heading for the ladies' room. She couldn't breathe, felt suddenly smothered and completely overwhelmed. She really honestly didn't want to hurt Ray Ray or Michael's bond at all, it was just such a shock to her that they were all there, and trying to arrange a bond between her surrogate human sister and her Alpha's brother. She really needed a moment to compose herself and get it together. She heard the door open behind her, she could smell Luna Darla immediately and her hands gripped the basin tightly. "It's okay Kellen," she sighed softly, "I'll understand, a bit of a shock to see us all here." "That's an understatement," Kellen bit out, trying to ignore her tone. First, it was Stephen with his gamma charm and now it was Darla with her Luna calm. She had to get out of here. Kellen stood up and tried to step around Luna Darla, but the woman blocked her way. "No Kellen," she said coldly, confident in her ability to be able to get her to listen. Lunas were supposed to be able to make the packs feel safe and give advice, be wise and fair. It was their gift from the goddess to be able to calm her pack members and engender trust. "Please just hear me out." Kellen shook her head. "No, you'll trick me." Darla chuckled and stepped closer to her, placed a hand on her arm. "Everything is going to be just fine Kellen. You can come home now. It's all safe and you're welcome, I assure you." Arya was listening intently. Kellen, too, couldn't help it. This woman was a Luna, a former Luna, but once a Luna always a Luna. Her power still seemed so strong, shouldn't it have lessened when the next Luna took over? She was sure it should have the minute of transfer to the new Alpha and Luna, when they took over the pack, but here she was right in front of Darla and her Luna power seemed just as strong as ever. Very odd. "I'm not safe there," she shook her head in denial. She could never believe she or her pups would ever be safe around the Luna, no matter what. "Yes, you are. I will vouch for your safety. Just come home. Derek wants to see you. Wants to meet your pups too." "We all do Kellen." She was rubbing Kellen's arm, stepping closer to her. Kellen knew what she was doing, same as Stephen trying to sway her, influence her into going home to the pack, a place too dangerous for her babies to ever be. She stepped away and shook her head. "No, stop it." She was using all her strength to resist the woman before her, hell-bent on convincing her to go home and take her babies with her. "Kellen, please sweetheart, all is just mixed up, it will be okay. I promise." "No," she whispered, squeezing her eyes tightly shut. Closing her eyes and not looking at her, when she had stopped looking at Stephen it had worked. Perhaps she could do the same with Darla. Arya was whimpering now, wanting to go home. That bastard had too many people, too much power and he was throwing all he had at her. He didn't even have to do it himself, everyone around him would do it for him and when he got his hands on her, then what? Fear crept in. Take her babies away from her for sure. To punish her even more for not going home, not taking them back to him once he knew about them. He was going to destroy her. Make her suffer the worst punishment, to bear the loss of her pups. He'd probably imprison her for the rest of her life and never let her see them ever again. All the worst scenarios were popping into her mind, bombarding her, increasing her ear tenfold. She could feel herself filling with distress at just the thought of it. Arya was whimpering now with her, now also trying to fight their former Luna's power over them. She did not want to be separated from her pups. Not for a single minute, let alone the rest of their lives. It would be better to die than suffer that. But his anger and fury would make him want to punish them, to make them suffer an eternity of pain away from their babies, and he had the power to make it happen. A simple word, a snap of his fingers and boom, her world over, her babies gone from her forever, and the torture of her and Arya's very souls would begin. Kellen's whole body was rapidly filling with dread, so much so she knew it was outweighing the Luna's calm, and she could feel it. Luna Darla's power was weakening over her. She yanked herself away from Luna Darla, staring at her. She registered Luna Darla's shocked look that she could fight off the Luna's power, then read sadness in her eyes, watched as tears filled her former Luna's eyes and distress started to pour out of the woman as she stared at her, almost as much distress as Kellen felt herself. Could she feel Kellen's fear? It was possibly she knew it was coming off of her in uncontrollable waves right this moment. Kellen shoved past her, her pain too great just thinking about the punishment that would come. She couldn't even bear the thought of it, it was too disturbing. She had to get out of here, away from them, all of them, back to her babies. Luna Darla called her name as she ran from the ladies' room. She pushed through the door only to run right into Alpha Blaine. He looked at her worriedly, then his eyes moved to his mate behind her, who had rushed out of the ladies' room after her. His eyes glazed over and Kellen took the chance to run, though she only got a few steps before his hand landed on her wrist, too fast even for her and Arya. Other than Derek, Blaine was the only wolf in the pack that could catch her. Kellen, wait, he practically begged her. No, leave me alone. It's really okay, he stated, no harm will ever come to you or your babies. She'll never let them live, Kellen whispered, pain ripping through her and Arya alike at the thought of someone hurting their pups. They were so tiny and defenseless and didn't deserve that fate, just because she had borne them. It wasn't their fault. About Sophia, honey, Luna Darla said softly, trying again to use her Luna calm. I don't care about her. Kellen snapped, Elle don't care, she is mated to him, and she truly didn't. She just desperately wanted to keep her babies away from her, keep them safe. It's what she lived for, their safety, and only she could provide it. She was their mother. Kellen, honey, she's gone. He has no Luna. Alpha Blaine rushed out, trying to stop her from leaving as she was pulling at the hand he had on her wrist, which was preventing her from getting away from leaving the restaurant. I still don't care, she yelled at him. Kellen could still recall their last encounter. He hadn't even known about her babies then, and the anger and fury coming off of him directed at her was clear to her, and now he did know, more reason for him to be furious at her. Arya, she begged her wolf to help her, to help them to she felt Arya push forward in a rush so fast, like she had done that fateful day that led up to this very moment. Their defiance was bound to get them in more trouble, but what more pain could she suffer than being separated from her pups forever by him, by the man she had loved with everything she had. Pain was pulling at her every fiber. She would never let him take them away, even if it meant defying every alpha in the Wolfen society. She would do it for them. We're strong, Arya, do it, she sobbed to her wolf, unable to cope any more with the pain inside of her. Alpha Blaine's whole body went rigid. He knew it was about to get very real, even though they were here in a human restaurant. Arya growled at him deep and viscous like Kellen had never heard her do before. All animalistic and primal, the days of her being a law-abiding pack member were long over, long dead. They might as well be rogues. Luna Darla shot in front of her Alpha, suddenly yanking his hand off of Kellen's arm. She heard a chair tip over and heavy footsteps coming this way fast. Michael was coming. Run, Kellen told Arya. There were no hands on her at present. We can't take all of them, and Arya turned and ran from the restaurant at the top of her wolf speed, not stopping for anyone or anything in her way. People were knocked over and she didn't care. They ran non-stop till they were a good dozen blocks away and certain no one was following them. Then they just stopped and stared at nothing, into the darkness of the night. Didn't know where they were. Looking around, she saw a bus bench and went and sat down on it. Arya had receded now, to the back of her mind, control handed over. They just sat for a long time not knowing what to do, then called a cab, unable to make sense of much of anything. Both their minds were more than a little chaotic, with many different thoughts from both of them crashing into each other, confusion ebbing in them both. For the first time in a long time they were both at a loss, and needed to pull themselves together. Then their thoughts aligned for a single moment. Pups and she was in a cab headed home, and had no idea what was waiting for her, to be honest. She wanted to go home desperately, but knew it was probably going to be a death sentence. They had just sized up Alpha Blaine and were ready to tear him apart or try to in order to get away. To be honest, she wanted her mum right now, to hold her and tell her everything was going to be okay, but that wasn't going to happen. She headed for her apartment, stopped the cab a block away and made her way on foot behind the building, careful to watch for any other wolves patrolling her building. She knew they were there. It took a good 20 minutes to find a gap in the patrol and slip through it, used her keycard to access the stairwell and climbed the flights of stairs to her floor. Would they still be there? Of course they would. Suzy hadn't called to say anything was wrong, and she would. They would not leave a mess in her apartment when killing her children. It was likely they were either unaware of the situation, she had removed their phones from them, or they were waiting for her to come home to take her in. Kellen stood by the fire door to her floor, biting her lip nervously on the fact that she wasn't ready to be brought in, so she turned and continued to the roof. The weather was turning cold, winter was almost upon them. How she missed the snow-filled winter days, the snowball fights with her brother, the snow drifts to hide in, pounce on, and generally play in. A sigh came from her, with many wolves around her making her very nostalgic. No wonder Arya had been off lately. Kellen stood and looked out over the city. This had been her home for so long, but deep down inside of her and Arya, they knew it wasn't home. No forest to run in. No wolves to socialize with, no other pups for her pups to play with. She had gotten so used to being alone. Was this how it felt to be a rogue? She wondered, overwhelmed when you could smell other wolves, stressed at knowing they were all about you, fear always on the edge of your mind, always deep down wondering when they would come for you, her fight or flight response constantly on alert. Adrenaline is never far from the surface. She had thought she was fine, but tonight proved her wrong. She was anything but fine. Had probably never been fine in all honesty. It was probably the reason she was fighting so hard not to go home. Her flight response was activated, and maybe it had always been, but she had just gotten so used to it being there she'd forgotten about it. It had become the norm. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, return to her normal state of being. It took several deep breaths, but she managed it. But yes, there in the corner of her mind was that constant nagging feeling of run. Even though she wasn't going to right this minute, it was there within her. She pushed it down hard, but now that she understood herself better, her response, she knew that one feeling had always been in her mind just so far back. She had learned to live with it. They could never go rogue. She did not want that overwhelming feeling of fear to be embedded in her children for all their lives. It was a hideous feeling. The Shadow Crest pack was looking much more appealing to her now than it ever had before. She walked down the stairs to her floor and pulled the door open and walked down the corridor to her apartment. Both Jackson and Stephen were still there. They were staring at her intently. They knew something had happened. She could tell from the way they both leaned off the wall, their bodies tense and ready for anything. She thought she could see concern in them, both of them, faked she imagined. She had no idea what time it was, or how long she had spent out on the street, or up on the rooftop for that matter. She was a little numb right that minute, just wanted to shut the world out and go back to being on her own with her babies. She wished they would all just go away and leave her alone, like she had been for the last 6 years. Kellen ignored their looks and went to her apartment, unlocked the door, retrieved their phones, and tossed them out the door. she didn't care if they caught them or if they shattered on the floor, then shut the door and locked it. Suzy was asleep on her couch. She covered her with the cream throw rug hung over the back of it, and let her sleep. She would pay her for the whole night. Then she walked through her apartment and looked at the girls. They were sound asleep safely in their beds. She walked to Nate's room and checked on him. It was like he knew. His eyes opened and he sat up bleary-eyed. "Mummy, what's wrong?" "Nothing, go back to sleep," she assured him and watched as he stared at her for a minute before lying down and closing his eyes to allow sleep to reclaim him. She walked to her bedroom, stripped off her dress, and lay down on her bed. The clock read 0137. She was utterly emotionally worn out. How were they going to survive this? Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.